I'm willing to accept that the gospel authors are accurately writing what they heard or believed to be true. In the same way that if my mom comes and tells me that she was abducted by aliens, I don't think my mom is lying to me. I'm willing to accept that she had an experience that she is trying to describe in that fashion, but that doesn't tell me what actually happened. And so when we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are anonymous gospels, not written by those names, ages ago when we can't investigate, and you have an oral tradition.
Dr. Mike, I saw that face, man. I saw the face. What you got, Dr. Mike?
Yeah. Well, let me just say this about Matt. I did debate him a few years ago, and I think it's a popular debate that's viewed online. On my channel, I think it's been viewed 600,000 times already. So my experience debating him was a pleasant one. We got along well, treated one another respectfully on stage, and yeah, I've got no problems with him. I do have problems with his arguments. To say that the Gospels are anonymous is a card that is it's overplayed big time. When it is true, I believe it's true that the Gospels in the autographs, in the original form, were probably anonymous. They probably did not contain the titles, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark. I think those were probably added later, maybe in the 2nd century. But it's overplayed, and here's why. When you take all the biographies that were written in that period, and over 100 of them, okay, in that period, if you just look at 150 years on each side of Jesus, this 300-year period, about any biography written about anyone, you have about 90, okay? But if you extend it even way past that, you've got over 100, okay? All of them are anonymous, with only 2 exceptions. You have the passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata in the middle of the 2nd century, and then you have the life of Elias in the Historia Augusta, written at the end of the 4th century. That's about a half a century after the Council of Nicaea. That's how late that is. Those are the only 2 that contain the author's name in it. The rest of them are anonymous. Biographies aren't the only thing. You can take the writings of Livy, one of the great Roman historians. It's anonymous. You can take the writings of Sallust, whom the famous Roman rhetorician Quintilian said was a better historian than Livy, and that you had to be advanced in your studies to appreciate him properly. All of Sallust's writings are anonymous. Plutarch, I should say Caesar's commentary on the Civil War. They're not only anonymous, Caesar wrote them, but it's anonymous, and it's written entirely in the 3rd person, much like the Gospel of John is. Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer by classicists today. He wrote over 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. None of them have Plutarch's name in the preface, in the proem, or the title, the preface, the proem, or anywhere throughout them. They're anonymous in the same sense the Gospels are. So if you're going to play this card and say, we don't even know who wrote the Gospels because they're anonymous, you've got to say that with a lot of the major Greco-Roman writings, which classicists are convinced that they know the authors of these. They don't even question it for a lot of them. The ones I mentioned, they don't question. And I would say that the evidence we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, it's not unimpeachable by any means, but our evidence we have for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the traditional authors is superior to the evidence we have that Plutarch wrote those lives, the biographies attributed to him. And yet you'd be hard-pressed to find a classicist today who questions whether Plutarch wrote those. So the bottom line, I think, there was still reason to think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them, even though they're anonymous in terms of the titles. Just as we have external evidence that would suggest that Plutarch wrote the lives, that Sallust wrote the war with Jugurtha, the war with Catiline, and his histories of Rome, and Livy's Roman histories as well, and all of those.
Dr. Gary, you got anything?
Yeah, Mike, I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you want to address the case for the what critics usually think is the best of all the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark? I mean, is this totally totally anonymous, and nobody has a clue as to who wrote it?
Well, I have at HBU, I've got some really sharp grad students there. And one was a guy named Joshua Pelletier. And so I supervised his MA thesis, and he did it on where critical scholars stand on some prolegomena related to Mark. Who wrote Mark? When was it written? And the third one, does it go back to Petrine tradition? Does it go back to the Apostle Peter, that he was the eyewitness that passed along the information to Mark? And so he surveyed more than 200 critical New Testament scholars writing since 1965 in English. Okay. So he didn't look at German scholars because he doesn't read German. He didn't look at French or any other, but over 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965 up to the present. And he found that the majority of them who comment on this think that Mark is the author of Gospel of Mark, and that his primary source was the Apostle Peter. And they also think that Mark wrote somewhere between the years 50 and 70. And you can narrow that further to between 65 and 70, the years 65 and 70. But the majority of those critical scholars who are discussing it in writing, in academic writings, are saying that Mark is the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark is correct.